All right, so we are recording now. This is a
Oh,
little bit, I know, right? But I'll trim all this stuff.
no, you're good.
Um, so this is gonna be a little different than the usual design streams where I'm just making stuff up. I've got a good friend, fellow designer here, Jeremy Gage. Jeremy, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to folks, and then we'll just talk, right? This
Just
isn't like
dive in.
an interview or anything. So, Jeremy, who are you? What's your deal?
Hi, everyone. You have probably heard my name a couple of times in the stream. Thank you, Spencer, for the continuous shout out. It's very kind. I am the host of the Draw Your Dice podcast, which is a podcast that focuses on gaining the principles, philosophies, and insights of game designers, new and veteran, and in order to create a platform that educates the next generation of designer or help a veteran designer find new musings for their current project. I am working on a game. It keeps
Yeah, you
switching.
are.
And yeah, that's about the real nitty gritty. I'm just in the game design space with no game yet, but working on it.
I think that's cool. I think that's awesome. I mean, I'm a little biased because I've been on Draw Your Dice a couple of times, but it is a really awesome podcast. You're right in that it like for anybody, it's good for anybody, and like
Mhm.
it's not just like new designers, just for like learning basics. It's everybody learns something. It's pretty awesome. But you and I have bonded over this idea of live, what we have called for a while live RPGs, which I
Yeah.
want to like we have our usual like coffee sit downs and everything like this to talk about this stuff. And we thought this time maybe we would record it just to see how that feels and
Mhm.
if the insights that we have is valuable and something that we could put out to the world. So when I guess we should introduce like the concept of a live RPG just real quick in case this is the first time folks have heard about it, because
Mhm.
like it's something that you and I talk about a lot, and in our space like we have some like tangential folks who are also interested in this. What's a live RPG to you? Or like let's just kind of like figure out what a live RPG is, and then we can kind of jump into the stuff that we wanted to talk about today.
Yeah, that's a huge question, Spencer. Thanks for putting that on me. No,
Why not just throw it right in? So I'll
no, no,
start
no, I
just to help
got
with that. Okay.
it. Yeah. No, so the idea behind live design, live RPG design is the principle that is a couple of principles. One, the product does not mainly go to print. That's not to say that a print product couldn't exist in the future of its existence, but the idea is that it's made wholly for the digital space. And that means so much more than just like a video game. It means like iPhone or tablet, or I'm sorry, iPhone is this brand, mobile applications, tablet applications, websites, talking about creating self-contained virtual tabletops and creating a design that is constantly iterated upon and produced out to the public based on consumer feedback, potentially, and also designer feedback. So an example, the closest model to thinking about this is an MMORPG like World of Warcraft, Guild Wars 2, Final Fantasy 14. All those games have expansions and patch updates and hot fixes that allow them to continue to tweak the experience for the gamer in question. And so the idea behind live RPG design is to think about how do we create an RPG that is, and I mean tabletop RPG traditionally, but create one that has patch updates, has expansions, has, Wizards of the Coast just recently did this with their Tasha's Cauldron product that they released for D&D 5e. And it has a lot of variant abilities for the classes that you're more than welcome to use in your game. But if you don't own the book, those options aren't there. So what if you just updated the class? I mean, for a long time, the Ranger class was one of the least interesting classes for people, maybe not on a narrative level, but on a mechanical level, it didn't hold up to the other design influences of the other 11 classes. And that's really a big issue because it's like, how do you rewrite a book that someone bought for $60 and then say, hey, go buy another player's handbook to get the new version of the Ranger? That's not going to fly, Chief. So we're thinking about something that allows for patch updates, something that is not just a PDF, but is like you go to www.novarpg.com. And if you've been following Spencer's other streams, you'll know what I'm talking about. But go to that and be like, oh, I'm going to make up a class name. The light suit. I don't know. I have no idea.
The game now, light suit.
But the light suit, we've had some feedback about the D6 die is a little small for their first ability. So we're going to upgrade that to a D8, see how that feels for a while. And then that's sort of the rules as written. I think the other thing that these principles stand behind is really looking at a rules as written format rather than a rules as intended format. And, there's gray space in between that nuance, but this is for more the person, like I am the person who operates rules as written, because if the rules are written this way, this means this is the intent by the designer to engage with the systems of the game. Going outside of those things or homebrewing those things and altering them creates a different landscape that the designer didn't intend, which is fine. That's an okay style of play. I don't want to knock anyone who's playing that way, but just for me, I love live RPG design because that's the way I think. And often we are creating games that we want to play. So that's my take on live RPG.
Yeah, I think the reason I pitched it to you is because it was all inspired by our conversation about light that we had. I don't remember when at this point, but I was, Light season 1 is wrapping up next month. And I was thinking about, all right, well, what is the next season going to look like? What have I learned from this first season? Because I like the season pass idea a lot. I like the modular feel of Light where you're plugging in whatever things you want to include in it. You could just purely use the core rules, which is like 1 page is all you need, but you can throw in whatever you want. And I remember coming to you and talking about like, all right, so like there's like pacing stuff that's bothering me and like other things about the season pass that I want to try and think about. And part of that conversation emerged this idea of, well, like what does Destiny do? Because Destiny is another one of these examples of not a live RPG, but like a live video game, right? Where it's just like every week you get new strikes, new dailies and weeklies and stuff like that. The Nightfall is new, and with that then comes incentive to come back and play more Destiny that week. And if Light is inspired so much by Destiny, it makes sense to maybe look at Destiny's model for creating content and supporting and continuously putting Light in front of people's eyes and be like, hey, remember this cool game that you like? There's more stuff for it. And coming from that conversation was the idea of doing something like weekly strikes with modifiers or like with specific loot. And I've talked about this a little bit on previous streams. I love this idea. I'm like obsessed with this idea now of the live RPG. And I even wrote down a note for myself with Nova coming along. Like, is Nova a live RPG or is Nova its own thing? Because Frame was not going to be a live RPG. That was one of the things that differentiated it from Light, is that it was a whole product. Like it was going to be a 40 some page zine book and it was just going to be done. Like, and I could always release more stuff, but it wasn't going to be like that season pass, here's the weekly mission sort of thing that Light had going for it. But now Frame doesn't exist. It's being turned into Nova. So the question is this an opportunity to just like shift because this live RPG thing is so cool? And I'm wondering, like, we don't need to get into is Nova going to be a live RPG, because that's a puzzle for me to solve at some point. But I'm curious, like I want to like brainstorm business models, because I think you have a sharp mind when it comes to that stuff, and I think you think about the business stuff, and you've mentioned it before, and I wish I could remember your quote specifically, because you're like, you don't think about like the business of like in a small term, you're thinking about it like of over a year or something like that. Like you think long term with this stuff, which I think for me, I don't at all. I'm flying by the seat of my pants every day with this. And so I really wanted today for us to talk a little bit about like what maybe business models for a live RPG, and we're gonna keep calling it live RPG until we have a better name, even if it confuses with LARPs or something like that. We'll come up with a better name,
Better
or,
acronym.
yeah, or something like that. But like, when I think of like business models for this, I think about, so we got like the season pass thing, right? Like that's one thing that Light has, is the concept of like a season pass where you're getting X number of pieces of content over a set period of time. And like that's a thing that you could do. And then you could always change the season pass. Like right now I have it set up where it's 4 modules over 4 months. You could change that rate. You could also, like looking at Destiny, a season is like, you can look at like the timeline snapshots of a season in Destiny. It's like all these small little events kind of drip fed throughout that time period, and like playing around with that so that maybe it's not just like modules, but it's like new little incentives to play the game. And that's where that whole weekly strike thing came from. And so I've been thinking about like season passes. I've been thinking about subscriptions and websites and stuff like that. And I know you just talked with Keegan a little bit about it. So I'm curious, like what you're thinking, what like maybe business model approach jumps out to you as the thing that maybe is most exciting or most interesting to follow. Do you have any like thoughts about that?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts.
Good.
And some of them are about that. So let's first examine the framework in which we're stealing the idea from, right? So MMORPGs, and there's a couple of models in that space. The first one is subscription based. You buy the game, there is the initial plus subscription model. So you have to buy the game first, and then you pay a subscription on top of that. That's one model. And that subscription allows people to continually get the feed and update of the game, and they can sort of pay at their own pace. But for a tabletop game, that might be a little extreme for a lot of people, just because of the transition one would have to take mentally from going from pen and paper tabletop RPGs into thinking about like paying a large sum of cash over a period of a year for a game. However, I think a lot of people, when they aren't really thinking about it, just to put some clarification for how much people spend on RPGs, D&D 5e is one of the most popular games on the planet. You know how much that game costs? People are going to be like, oh, it's like $50 for the player's handbook. Sure, but if you're the game master, you're looking at $150 for the monster manual, the DMG, and the PHB, right? And then to even go beyond that, at some point, you may be sharing the PHB with a bunch of players, but it's not quite that efficient or friendly. So then for every amount of player you have at the table, let's say the common 4, they're each going to buy their own PHB. That's another $200. So like at some minimums, you're spending at least $350 to play D&D 5e, split amongst 5 people, but still, nevertheless, you're spending that amount of money. Right. Not including any other supplements that you purchase, right? Xanathar's Guide to Everything, Volo's Guide to Monsters, Mordenkainen's Tomb of Foes. That's $50, another $150 you spent over the year for print supplements. And then we examine the D&D Beyond model, which I'll get more in depth to in my thoughts in a second. But that's just to point out that people are still doing a sort of purchase the game up front and pay a subscription for content over the period of the year, because I think they aim to release 4 books a year, 1 per quarter. Right. So you have like a $200 subscription over the year, right? So that's one model we can examine, right? If that's what people are willing to spend for D&D 5e, now it's important to note that they're a very large brand. So when we come from an indie space, can we command $350 over the course of the year? Maybe. You know, it's all about finding those true fans who are willing to spend like $100 on you for the month or whatever. But it's a potential. So you could take those figures and like sort of break out a subscription. Like, what does a virtual tabletop subscription look like in that case, right? And then the other so that's the first format. That's the first model we're examining from. Then there is the free, but you buy expansions after, right? So maybe there is an SRD. This is similar to
doesn't like WoW do this?
Yeah. I don't think that every once in a while you can get vanilla for free, but I don't think they do.
Oh.
I think Guild Wars 2 might do this. You can get Guild Wars 2 for free,
Right.
but you have to buy Heart of Thorns or Path of Fire, which often they bundle together.
Gotcha.
So you get all the base content, and then anything that's expanded upon, you have to buy after. And then after so much aging on a product, they usually start, at least for, what are they called? ArenaNet. ArenaNet will bundle those expansions together so that they're cheaper for you to get at a whole value. So that's another model. Pay for free up front, play for free up front, and then pay for subscriptions, right? That's another model.
Now that I think about it, an extremely appropriate model is Destiny. Destiny's new light model, which is it's free. It's free for people to play and get like a real base entry level to Destiny. And then it is, well, now you've got a sense of like what playing as a Guardian is like, and you can buy the expansions and eventually get the season pass. So yeah, exactly. Like that's, it gets people in, it gets them hooked. The first taste is free sort of thing. And then you get them going and going.
And now that I'm reminded, WoW does let you play for free up to level 20. That is correct. You are correct on that.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So it seems like it's pretty common in like a lot of the big computer video game space that is doing this sort of thing.
And then the last one, which is sort of similar to the last example, what is microtransactions, right? So, and also something to extrapolate from is D&D Beyond. So they have digital content at a reduced cost because it's not print. So like you're paying $25 for the PHB, but even still cut that $350 in half and you're still paying that much for a single game, right? So keep that in mind, everyone who's watching this. But they have options to like, maybe I don't want all of Xanathar's Guide to Everything. Maybe I just want the samurai subclass, right? So I can pick that up and then I'm happy. Like I spend, I think a class is like $2.99 or something like that. And you can buy, and then they even have like packages, like you can buy all the classes for like $10, and that's subtracted from the expansion book as well, at least in that digital format. So that's also something interesting to look at, as like a microtransaction. And we talk about modular design for Light and Nova, now that when you add new optional rules and stuff, people can just purchase those, like that text of optional rule. And this is only effective in a live digital space, because in print they're not going to buy a page of something to put into their model, right? Unless you're selling it like a single PDF and they want to print it out and they add it to their binder. That's an option, but that's like, I don't know, it's like a hassle to like design that and then create a single PDF for that to work, for them to print out, to put into something to remind themselves, right?
I remember Adam Bell mentioned something about this recently, about like, well, you could just send out a binder that has like the 3-ring binder that has the core rules, and then you can just mail people the new module every month or whatever if you wanted to do it with print. Because Adam Bass was asking, how is this going to be done with the print? And I think it certainly would work, but I think it would be a huge hassle to do.
And then we get back into the converse. So one thing I didn't mention about when I was offloading about live design for the two of us is that there are two other things to consider that virtual tabletop design can be an improvement towards. Is one, accessibility, and two, sustainability or eco-friendly things. So on accessibility, we're in the age of auditory programs, which can turn text to speech for people that may not be able to see. We have e-readers for people that may have color blindness issues, especially when it comes to art. And then even thinking about like art direction for, as I'm just saying this, like if you create a digital application or digital book of this that is effective, you could have a colorblind mode for your art. You know what I mean? Like that could be very cool for people who may get a little overwhelmed by art products inside of print products. And the other one is sustainability. So digital means no paper, right? There's no sort of carbon footprint. Now, that's only like a half truth, because like computers and tablets and phones are also waste in some format. But glass and silicon things, to my knowledge, can be recycled. So as long as it's not plastic, sure, great. I mean, it's still an advent to think about the sustainability of products like this, right? Because really, at the end of the day, a book is sort of like a status luxury product, like a print book. And I'm not here. I think what's important to say is that I'm not here to knock books or print products by any stretch of the imagination. I think there will always be a place for that in this world. But, you know, I have, just guessing, I have like 60 books right here, and I have 60 books in the other room that, like 60 of them I've not opened in years. Like they just continue to sit around to say, hey, I'm a smart person who reads, right? Like that's all they really say when someone steps into my home. Do I need that? Not necessarily. Also biased, I live a very minimalistic life. So my way is not the way for everybody. But yes, the two things I wanted to like sort of side tangent on is accessibility and sustainability when we think about digital design. But like I was saying, the last bit there was microtransactions. So getting the game for free and then getting cosmetics, achievements, the ability to purchase single sections of rules that, and that comes with certain design constraints too, because when you think about designing those sort of microtransaction pieces, you have to, and if you consider that sort of like pick what you want market, you have to consider like, you have to be able to design a paragraph to be executable without its entire other product. That's also something to consider, right? I think D&D and D&D Beyond can only do this because magic items can be executed without the whole book that they come from. Classes can be executed without the whole book that they come from. Monsters can be executed without the whole book that they come from. Backgrounds, like they all have enough information is put into the base game that people can just pick and choose what they want out of it. And that creates a nice digital model for them to execute. And then, so that would be, those are sort of like the frameworks at which we are looking at when it comes to live RPG design and stealing from the MMO space. So those are my first thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think like the first two certainly make the most sense to me, or they translate the easiest in my mind into what this would ultimately look like in an RPG, because when you look at games that are purely microtransactional, things like League of Legends, like look at a lot of MOBAs or like battle royale games that are free, but then like you're either paying like for the battle pass thing, which is its own thing, or it's cosmetics, right? You want the skin for your character so you look different, or you can technically grind out to unlock every hero in the game, but it takes forever, so you could just bypass that by buying the hero right away. So that works really well with those sorts of games. Cosmetics is just one of those things that I struggle in my mind to think about how that could ever translate to our scene as something that is a sellable asset, right? You know,
well, D&D Beyond does it. They do it with digital dice, and they do it with custom character sheet situations like icons and background splash, which is like not necessary. Like even when you talk about League of Legends, like you don't have to buy the skins, you know what I mean?
Exactly. But the idea of the either like you buy the core or get the core for free, and then it is sort of this sustained model via a subscription is interesting to me, because right now how Light is being supported is through season passes. So it's not exactly a subscription, because it's like it's kind of a subscription, but it's not the same thing as like a monthly subscription sort of thing. It's like you're going to pay X amount of money and know that you're going to get these things over a period of time, 4 modules over 4 months. And I think the season pass model is interesting. I think from our conversations, it has its shortcomings that I have found to be frustrating or need tweaking in terms of what season 2 would look like if I'm doing season 2 with Light. And so while I'm thinking about the things that I want to change about the season pass, I'm thinking about the other models. And like when you think about a subscription model with RPGs, it's not an unheard of thing because we see a similar thing with Patreons, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Right.
like
Yeah.
a Patreon is a subscription to a creator rather than a specific. It can be for a specific game, because some people just make Patreons for like, I'm gonna make this game and I'm just gonna keep adding to it or showing you more stuff about it on a month-to-month basis as I do it. But a lot of the Patreon folks that we know in the RPG scene are like, every month I'm going to release like a new game or a new thing that's not necessarily one thing being continuously supported, but you're just supporting me, the creator, every month. Like, you know, I'm a patron of Adam Vass and Chris Bizet because I know I love those designers, and I'm like, I just want that constant monthly drip feed of their very good stuff.
Shout out to great creators.
I know, right? They're so good. So the idea of a monthly subscription is not a new sell necessarily to RPG folks. It's maybe a slightly different sell, or just because it's like, it's for this game sort of thing, and you're gonna keep getting stuff for this game. But I've been wondering about like what that, what ultimately, and it's very game dependent, right? Like what is going to be in that, what's that monthly thing that you get, or what's that consistent drip feed that you're getting. um for the season pass and light, it's a module every month, but for light live, which is that other thing that you and I have been talking about, it's weekly strikes with like a fun little like briefing that you get sent for your group to read and look at, and there's like a unique gun or whatever that you can earn by doing it. And I think we even talked a little bit about raids, and I talked on a design stream about what raids in Light Live would look like, as sort of this week by week thing. You're taking it on in chunks, and then eventually it turns into a pool of loot at the end. And so I'm curious to know what your thoughts are on that idea of like a monthly subscription versus a like upfront thing with the season pass, knowing that you're going to get X things. Because I think there's pros and cons to the two things. And I'm trying to think about, with a monthly subscription, what is it that like you get for a monthly subscription? And I'm not saying solve this problem for Light for me right now, but I'm thinking just broadly speaking, like across any RPG that would want to do a live thing, what a monthly thing would look like. And I'm inspired because you mentioned in your interview with Keegan about having like a website. And so like you would have a website that would have like maybe the free version of the rules, but then like a member's login gets you access to the cool shit behind the curtain, right? And so what is that cool stuff? How do we incentivize or make it worth people's while to do a month to month sort of thing? Or is that maybe not the route we should be thinking about? Should we be thinking more about like chunks, like the quarterly chunk thing, like a season, just like that's what Wizards of the Coast is doing, right? Like their subscription, like you said, is 4 quarters of a book a quarter. I don't know. I see the pros and cons of each, and I'm not sure which one is the most enticing to me. And I'm sorry, I'm rambling long here, but it reminds me, and it connects back to that phrase that you use a lot that I like a lot, which is the idea of 100 fans, right? Those 100 loyal fans that are going to, like, they're going to follow you. Like those are your core that will always follow you, sort of thing. And I think it's really important for us as creators to try and develop that. I think that's really, if you want to sustain yourself in any way off of this, then like you need to do that. If you don't care about, like, if you don't need to sustain yourself off of it, or you're not interested in that, then of course you don't need to have like the 100 loyal fans. But we're talking about a business model here, so I think we got to talk about it. So which of those models, I think, so let me put the question in a more structured way. Which of those models, sort of like a quarterly package thing versus a month-to-month thing, do you think is more conducive for like the 100 fan approach, the 100 like loyal fan mentality that one would want for a sustainable business model like this?
So just to elaborate, like what the I think it's actually 1,000 true fans, but
Oh,
either
no.
way, no,
We
it's
have
fine.
so much more work to do.
It's But the idea behind the true fan is someone who loves you or your brand or your product so much that they are willing to spend like $100 on it every month. In theory, they're willing to, because that's how you create a sustainable business for yourself, right? You have 100 people every year for 12 months who's going to come back and spend the amount of money you need to make a living. There are tons of businesses that do this, that follow this philosophy. This isn't something like Swarmy or whatever, or Slimy. It's just like one of those facts of business, right? Especially as we're not going to get rid of capitalism anytime soon, so we might as well learn how to play the game for the betterment of ourselves and the betterment of our communities, rather than wallow in despair about it and not play the game, which will be the game will fight you. As any RPG player will tell you, if you try to go outside the rules, the game will fight you a little bit. But to talk about the season pass structure, right? So again, the use sort of the shared language we've established so far, the season pass is really an expansion. That's what it really is. It's that's released over the course of a number of months, and the releases are the patch updates. So the example is like World of Warcraft. So World of Warcraft releases an expansion, and the first thing you get to do during the first 2 weeks of the game is the story questing. You get your character to max level, you play all the story quest stuff, you start grinding dungeon gear to get ready for raiding, which releases on the third week. On the third week, it releases the first wing of the raid. Depending on how many bosses the raid have, let's assume the common 12. So they'll release 3 bosses. That's a wing of the raid. You get to run those 3 bosses, or excuse me, this is for the raid release is full for people who want to do the hard mode of the raid. But for people who want to take it easy, they have a looking for grouper or looking for finder. Can't remember what the term is, but it's an easy mode that releases 3 bosses at a time over 4 weeks. So about it and wholesale, or they can take it very casually but run it 3 bosses every week up until that 6th week. Now is when the full raid is released for that looking for group casual play, pickup group thing. So really, season pass to me in video game terms relates to expansion, and those monthly releases relates to patch updates, right? So I think one of the things to consider is that you already did the expansion model. You said, pay this money up front. This is what you're going to get. That's what an expansion is for a video game. Pay this money up front. This is all the content you're going to get over a period of time. The one thing to think about for that particular business model is that you have to have a really good track of what you're going to make for the year, right? If we're thinking about a sole game where you're keeping it sustainable throughout the year, you have to think about the size of the game and the size of the expansions you're releasing. That will also help inform the value of your pricing. And, I think there's a whole nother podcast that talks about value pricing and everything like that. But the other option, the subscription model, and I think you kind of said something interesting there about the member login, right? So maybe there's a free version that people can play and take their tables, but maybe there's content locked behind a subscription, right? The weekly strikes and the monthly raids is an example we can use. No one else gets to see that except for people who go to the member login. And we talk, I think in your Discord and on which you should join the Gila RPGs Discord. Make sure you do. It's a fun time. Plug. And in your stream, you have talked about how to create an honor system for that stuff, right? Where it's the first initial idea that we had about these strikes and raids was that it would be some sort of Twitter bot that would spit out a briefing that would tell you hey, here's the strike this week. These are the enemies you have to encounter, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But when we think about abusing the digital space, and maybe there's something in the member login that releases that briefing to everyone who has a member login or whatever, because this is in a website, right? And websites often have member logins with secret bullshit behind them, right? So not only that, but in a digital website landscape, things are trackable. You can say who clicked this button 10 times. You can do a whole bunch of things, whole bunch of machine learning algorithms, right? But you could certainly do something behind that where it's your database, or maybe you write it up before, but maybe there there is a sort of PvE experience you could create for the game where like it populates the encounters for you, so you're not running that, right? And then, you know, did you win? Because I think about virtual tabletop has a hotkey system for their virtual tabletop. So what that means is that like you can take, if this were D&D 5e, you could take your rage, assign it to hotkey 2, and it would auto populate in the chat box to say that you used it, right? Like roll, like the Roll20 way of typing it out or clicking on it, but it's on a hotkey, right? So why can't you execute those hotkey things and that data tracking inside of a website or a virtual tabletop specific to your game? And what's interesting is that like, when you think about, because people are like, well, why don't you just use Roll20? I'm sure there's some people out there who said, why don't you just use Roll20? Why don't you just use actual tabletop? Why don't you just use multiverse, whatever have you? And I think that that's a general basis. But when you think about designing content specific to a digital space, I think it has to, maybe not has to, I'm sure someone could figure it out, but execute its own ecosystem, right? And if there are, it's really outside the box thinking, because we've been pen and paper. How do we track? I think about Adventure League for D&D 5e, right? How do people like, it's all honor system there. They have it, but like you have like, I could make any character sheet I fucking want and bring it with me, right? Like there's so many ways to game that system. And I could have something way above the level of what is necessary just because I'm that kind of min-max person. I am not. But there's also nothing wrong with min-maxing. Balance is an illusion.
Down with balance, man.
Destroy it. But yeah, thinking about the subscription model, maybe it's something, another side tangent conversation. This is me now talking the long version, but there's a lot of, I'm a very systems thinker. So I think of the things that a single idea touches on, and then that touches on other ideas, right? So when you think about the pricing of a subscription model or even a game, it's a lot of us, this is very similar to how art space, where like a beginning artist who wants to get their career going, they race to the bottom. They want to undercut everybody because they want to make sure that people will buy the work. Art is a hard thing. It's a very subjective thing to put a value on that doesn't attach it to a brand or a person, right? So we really like, I think there are a lot of people who create really cool games space, but say like the digital PDF is the cheap version for whatever reason. It's not, because if you think about the amount of work you put into that PDF and the amount of work that you put into the print product are the same thing. They're getting the same layout, they're getting the same art, they're getting the same words. So why charge $10 for the PDF and $25 for the print? Some people might say, hey, I'm charging $25 for the print because it's distribution and pay. But still, you put all of that work into it, and the only thing that's changing is the paper. You like feel the worth of your design work. You know what I mean? Like charge 25 for the digital.
Yeah.
And so my point bringing that up is that thinking about the pricing of subscription and thinking about like, what are people willing to pay? Because subscription can be the great version of this, where it's like, it's a really hard sell for people who come from pen and paper places of play, because they only have to pay the one time. Like I've never had to pay a subscription for a tabletop role-playing game in my life. Maybe you have. For the person that's saying that, you just don't realize that you're paying a subscription. When we've already explained Patreon, the D&D book expansions, you're paying some form of opt-in subscription and opt-out subscription. You don't have to buy the D&D supplement books, right? That's a $50 you saved that quarter or whatever. But some people buy every book just to have the collection, and they have that like sunk cost fallacy situation. So like they just keep buying, or they love the game and they keep buying, right? Like, but in some way, someone has done a subscription model and you're just not thinking of it as a subscription, but you're engaged in it in that way.
It's interesting. One of the things that really jumps out to me in what you were describing is that a subscription model, for me, I was mostly just thinking about it as content, right? So it's X content that you get on a monthly basis, but you mentioning ideas about sort of like around this idea of table or tools and resources, access to tools and resources that you wouldn't normally have if you don't have the subscription model is very interesting to me as well. So like a subscription for Lite not only gets you that week's module or whatever that comes out, but it gives you access to the website's tools for strike generation or combat encounter generation or loot tables, and it just builds the loot for you and with just a click of the button. And having access to that stuff as well as the additional content that you're getting on a monthly basis is really interesting to me as a thing that could be linked up with the subscription.
I mean, Roll20 does it too, right? For a long time, you could only do dynamic lighting through buying a pro subscription, which is $5 a month, right? You're paying, I mean, I think there are some other tools and you get access to like premium token assets and stuff, but still those things are only available to subscription people. And, you know, you're paying $5 a month for a dynamic lighting tool that you don't really need. You know what I mean? Like in the scope of everything, you've played pen and paper games, you've put it on the table and it's cool. The reason why, one of my theories or intuitions about why people pay for dynamic lighting, right? Fog of War is like that it's immersive, right? Like it's bringing together the ecosystem of playing a video game, but also playing a tabletop thing. So I guess now that I'm saying that, there might be like an underlying hunger for this sort of like self-contained game ecosystem that people aren't realizing, right? We use dynamic lighting because it creates an immersive experience, which is something I want at the table. You can't see around the corner. You can't see further than 60 feet. You don't have to like theater of the mind guess. It creates a lot of clarity for people, especially in a game like D&D that demands the ability to see and by 5-foot increments because it's important to spells and abilities and things, right? But thinking about like that sort of want or need for that clarity means that there are tools that people are willing to pay for to create a more immersive experience. So if that is strike generation, if that is combat generation, if that is a virtual tabletop that can simulate the effects of just space, just throwing it out there, right? Just like you can be on a planet that has different gravities and maybe it keeps track of environmental changes for you, right? Like all of that stuff could produce desire and thus you have the supply for it, right?
Right. It's yeah, my brain is thinking a lot now about things that would be useful tools, assets, resources, and things like that to folks who are regularly wanting to play Light and having access to those things, just expediting the process. I think that's a big part of it too, is just ease of play, right? If anything that we can do to help keep the game moving. One thing that we haven't, we talked a little bit about it that I think is also really exciting about this is the ability to do, like you've been mentioning this idea of patch notes, and I think that's a really important thing. Like you talked about it with the Ranger class getting a hypothetical update in the future based off of something. And for me, I have it written down as I want to go back and check on the core rules of Light. Like I want to go back and just update them at some point. And part of having a live design then allows me to go do that, to go change the core rules and just be like, just so you know, I've updated it. I've made this part clearer, whatever. And if I've printed it, which I have printed Light, like I made a print of it, but I probably won't print it more in the future just so that I can continue to tinker with it and stuff like that. I think that's really valuable. I think that's very cool. I just think this whole idea of live RPGs is exciting. It's obviously not it doesn't have to be the thing for every RPG. I think the reason it strikes me so much is because the games that I am designing right now they come from that looter shooter space, which is inherently linked up with these games as a service sort of idea where you're just continuously getting stuff, you know. Could it work for Slayers? Of course. Could it work for Corvid Court? Of course. Am I going to turn all of my games into live games? Who knows? Maybe I will now. Maybe I've convinced myself that I will. But I think it's really exciting, and I'm gonna take it. I have to promise myself that I will take it one game at a time. Try and do this with all of them. It's totally unsustainable, but I think it's cool. I think it's cool.
Yeah, I think something to maybe shine on as well is that you mentioned that this isn't a principle for every game. It's not. There are certain limitations that you are not going to get at in a paper RPG. I think there are different things. Like some people use, what am I thinking of? Kurt Potts did a game called Dark Sigil. I believe it has another name to it, but
Sigils in the Dark, I think.
Sigils in the Dark, yes. And one of the core mechanics of the game is that you draw a rune or a sigil or whatever have you, and that isn't going to feel as good in a digital space. It's something about the creation of that rune or sigil on a piece of paper, on the parchment in which the game's thematics sit behind, that it has to be executed that way. Otherwise, it's going to create a completely I think it'll create a very disconnected feeling, and that's not something executable for that game in a digital space, right? You could say like, oh, why don't I just, some people may disagree. They may have like a Wacom tablet or whatever where they can draw on and it'll still feel the same to them. And that's fine if that's what and maybe, actually not, I say it, you could totally like tablet and maybe execute that. Either way, what I'm saying is that there's some tactile things like rolling dice, moving miniatures, depending on the thematics of the game, that a digital application just won't feel as good as. And I want to say that I recognize that, even though I'm totally like a modern technologies junkie. Like I want to see the evolution of tabletop games into, I like the sight of thinking about 5 people sitting around a table with tablets in front of them,
Right.
Not like because I think a lot of people look at them like, oh, they'll be so distracted by internet things and blah, blah. But like, what if you could do some sort of augmented reality thing where all the iPads cameras are pointed to the center of the table and it's creating this really cool digital play space for you, right? What if, even if not that, you're all linked up to the same sort of ecosystem room in which you can move your miniature, like people sort of do this on, what is it called? Encounter table, Encounter 5e. I think it's a digital tabletop thing that has like a linked up web page space where like everyone can go on their phone or their iPad and move their miniatures around and explore and touch things and click things. There's also stuff like an Astral Tabletop has technologies where like you can click on signs or handouts like that have a 3D model in the space to read them. So there's a lot of cool digital applications, but I think it does have its constraints when it comes to thinking about what sort of game gets designed in that sort of space.
Right. I'm so excited. Like I'm gonna sit down and try and put down some ideas about what a live version of Light is going to look like here in the near future, just because, season 1 wraps up next month, which means, I could, in theory, in May, launch a new season and it could keep the same model, or I could make some tweaks, or I could, brew on it for a little bit and put together this cool Light Live thing and then kind of relaunch with that. I'm excited about it. I think it's going to be a really fun thing to sort of expand on. And every time we talk about it, I get ideas. I think I understand what it could be more and more, because my earliest understandings of this truly were like, you just get a new thing, a new PDF every month. Like that's what it is. And it certainly can be that. But it can also be so much more. And I think that's the really exciting thing about live RPGs, or whatever we're going to call these things eventually when we get a great name down on the page for it.
Virtual RPGs, even Lancer, like Lancer has its own app compendium. How many D&D 5 character sheet apps exist in the Google Play Store or Apple Store? You know what I mean? Like there are 10. I could look it up right now and there are 10 character sheets, different applications I could get. It's like the stuff is already sprinkled throughout our entire tabletop RPG ecosystem. I think it's going to take some people to really say, let's figure out what a full digital format looks like. And I guess I also want to say before we get out of here is that like, I don't think that this isn't a conversation about the death of print, because like I just said, print's always going to have its place. But I think what's important to recognize is that digital is not going to stop coming.
Right.
Like print is never going to overtake digital. I think in some capacities, digital is definitely going to overtake print, especially when we talk about environmentalism, accessibility for people, the audio oral technologies like the Google Homes and Alexas and stuff. Like I've been getting ads for like the last 2 years because I do like the kit research stuff. But there are people who are making games for Alexa, and not just like Jeopardy and bullshit, like actual like choose your own adventure, narrative point and click, but voice and click games, right? So that also has applications for a digital role play space.
It's cool. It's very cool. All right, I think we did a pretty good job of kind of covering like the concept, and I think today obviously we focused on the business model, which I think that's what I was interested in talking about. So I'm glad that we got some cool insights into that. So Jeremy, thanks so much for coming and talking to me on this sort of ad hoc design stream. You wanna promote your stuff? You got cool stuff. Now's a cool chance to throw it, and I'll put all your links and everything in the YouTube description and everything. But
thank you.
Why don't you shout out some of your stuff?
Yeah, you can find me at Jeremy Gage 5 over on Twitter if you want to talk any more about this, other things, anything. Once again, I host the Draw Your Dice podcast where you get to listen to very cool designers, including Spencer, who's been on there twice, maybe 3 times soon, where you learn about where they come from a game design background, what led them to designing games, and dissecting some of their most recent projects per the recording of that episode. But definitely something to check out. And we're getting more into talking about the future business of game design and applying these same techniques we're talking about here today when we talk about stuff like degreening and itch funding and all of that. So yeah.
Sweet. Awesome. Well, this was a ton of fun, everybody. Hope you enjoyed this design stream on like live RPGs and stuff like that. There'll be a lot more of it. You have certainly not heard the last of this. So let's say goodbye. See ya.
Bye.